Good afternoon, family. Welcome back again to our channel. I hope you have been enjoying what we're producing, and if this is your first time to watch what we're doing, I hope it'll be worth your time. And at the end of it, if you find it worthy, I hope you subscribe. Now, today I'm going to walk you through an entire lunch meal preparation for my two supervisors who are always with me. For those who, again, are seeing us for the first time, we are in Karateng, which is a village in Kisumu. And today I'm home with the two little supervisors. The oldest is 6 and the youngest is 3, the one that I call my temporary lastborn. And as we walk through the video, I'm going to talk about a topic that is I've been struggling with. I wasn't even sure whether I'm ready to talk about it publicly, but the truth is, I'm really struggling with fatherhood. On camera, it might seem like it's all peaches and cream and we figured it out, but in truth, this is one of the things I've really struggled with. And today's video is going to be unlike any other video that I've done in the past because I have no suggestion for you, and I'll be asking to learn from you. And so folks who know a little bit more than I do that could help those who are in my position, I hope you'll be willing to share your thoughts and experiences in the comment section. Now, again, if you're meeting me for the first time, I am a father of 2 kids, 1 boy and 1 girl, but there are many, many kids in my orbit, and you'll be seeing them in many of my videos. And so many folks who know me would either know me as a professional, as a parent, or many other roles. But the one role that I take most seriously, the one that I really draw a lot of joy from, is my role as a father. And just to give you a little bit of background, I grew up in a small village, and I had the privilege to be raised by 2 parents in a very loving community. Just like many of my peers, my upbringing was very similar to most of the folks around me. Unfortunately, some of my peers did not have the same experiences. Some of them had no biological dads, but there were many father figures around us all the time, whether it was uncles, friends, and things like that. And we grew up in a community where collective responsibility was really the norm. And so neighbors would respond to emergencies. They would respond to school-related issues. We were really the very definition of when they say it takes a village to raise a child. So that's the kind of community I grew up around. And my experiences with father figures were sort of mixed. On the one hand, we had some really good fathers who generally were focused on providing basic needs like food, shelter, and things like that. And many of them, for the most part, left primary care of the kids to the mothers. So things such as clothing, getting showered, feeding, all of that was mostly a women's thing. And when we were younger, I think before age 10, our fathers were a lot closer than us. And then as we grew to our teenage years, they were more seen as disciplinarian. And so for the most part, we saw them as people who were there to take care of business and do other things that had little to do with us. Now, in my circle too, I had friends who had less involved fathers. And many of them just simply worked a lot. And when they came back from work, they would hang out with friends, perhaps till late. And of course, a lot of them seem to be more connected to people outside their families than their family members. And so if you watch them interacting with non-family members, you'd see a lot of warmth. But when they would be interacting with family members, they would be a lot more strict and a lot more reserved. Some of them had trouble handling their stuff. And so a lot of the burdens or the responsibilities of the family were taken care of by the women in their lives. A few had alcohol issues. Some of them were not so nice to women in terms of physical violence. There's also a small group of them who were so much into church in terms of their time and had very little time left for their families. And so I've got friends who had a similar upbringing as mine, and others really struggle with their father figures in their lives. However, the image of fatherhood that we grew up around were defined by the following things. For the most part, we thought fathers were mostly responsible for things, quote unquote, major things like shelter, school fees, food, and all that. And for the most part, fathers were less involved in girls' lives. And issues around women, particularly for their young girls, were considered taboo topics. And so if girls had questions, they would be sent to their mothers. And as I mentioned earlier, fathers were often seen as ultimate disciplinarians who were to be feared and to be served. I would see my mother bring water to my father, bring food, and she still does that even now. Men were expected to just sit down and have women serve them in the home. But of course, they were also seen as protectors. So if there's something happening outside of the house, they would be expected to step out and check it out and things like that. But also, they were seen as the final authority in almost everything. So whether it was finances, whether it was schools and things like that, the father's word was basically law. And so, in a sense, they were almost like figures who were above the law within the house. So, good or bad, we really credit these father figures for many, many things in our lives. And I'll just highlight a few. Our successes around education. A lot of it, our fathers really contributed a lot. And then the limits we've had in life, just knowing boundaries. Fathers really played a big role. And of course, many of the opportunities that have come our way are connected to the father figures in our lives. And of course, they did not do this alone. The roles that the women have played in our life is beyond amazing. And I'll just dedicate one full video to that. So just because I'm talking about fathers here does not mean I'm discounting the role that our mothers or female figures have played in our roles. Today, I'm just focusing on fatherhood, and that's why I'm not putting so much work on the mother side. And I will do that in the next video. So overall, I would say that some things worked while others did not. Despite all the work they put in, some things really worked out, but others did not. And so I think some of my failures as a father, or some of the things I'm struggling with as a father, may be attributed to the lessons I learned growing up around men in a small village. So fast forward to America, I find myself in a space where I'm raising Kenyan American kids in a very different world. And so I think some of my struggles, or some of the struggles of my friends that I see, may be related to the following facts. And number one, it is likely that we try to father our kids in the same way that we were fathered in Africa over 40 years ago. And I'm not so sure that is working quite well in some areas, while I think we've seen progress in some areas. And besides just the idea that we're trying to father in the same way we were fathered, there are some things that are really different when you compare raising kids in America versus raising kids in Africa, especially when you're raising black kids. So the first difference, of course, is the different cultural climate that we currently live in America. In my neighborhood, for the most part, things are less patriarchal. And so women have a much greater voice than they would have in the community where I grew up in. And then the issue of gender roles are perhaps not as magnified as they were. And so fathers are just as involved in girls' life as they do in boys' life. And that may have been different where I was raised. And then, of course, expectations of men are very different. For example, when I moved to America, I just learned that men are expected to really sit in the delivery room. And I did that with my two kids. Sitting there watching my wife go through the knife and all the entire thing. I sat through it. When I was raised, my fathers and the fathers in our lives would sit at home, wait for their wives to deliver, and bring back home the child. So expectations are wildly different than what I saw. Things such as sharing duties at home. When I grew up at home, of course, it was never 50-50. Where I live in Long Beach right now, for the most part, we almost split duties with my wife, almost 50-50. And so it's not a problem, but this is just the world that I live in. I would say legally speaking too, there are a lot more legal protections for women and men as well. Perhaps much more so than we had growing up 40 years ago. And then, of course, in America, there are far fewer family members who are available to provide support and guidance. But besides the cultural difference, we are also living with very different spouses compared to what our fathers lived with 40 plus years ago. Many of us marry non-Kenyan wives, and even the Kenyan wives that we live with have slightly different expectations than the previous generation. Like in my case, my wife is born and raised in the city in Nairobi. I was raised in the village. Culturally, we can be very different on so many factors. So yes, the women we are living with now are not exactly what we grew up around in terms of our mothers. And of course, the children we're raising are very different. For example, our kids in America or in many diaspora places are taught to express themselves. So Americans like using this term that use your words. We didn't grow up around that. As a kid, there was nothing like expressing yourself around adults. You were there to be talked to and to simply act. Our kids don't do that. And of course, many of our kids expect to be treated like their other American peers who are not being raised in Kenyan households. And so when they go out there, they see different things, they come back and raise or change expectations. Some of them, or actually I would say many of them, are taught very early on how to call authorities. And so if something is happening at home that is considered dangerous by what they've been told, the kids are told to call 911. And like in our case, if you're spanking a child, they may end up calling 911 on you, which can turn out in all kinds of ways. Many of our kids today have a lot more access to information, good or bad. Growing up as a kid, we never had a TV until very later on in life. Of course, there was no such thing as internet or phones and all that. The kids we're raising right now have access to all kinds of information, way more than we did growing up. Physically, our kids are a lot bigger than we were. And that really has significant implications, especially for black boys being raised in America. Many of them mature a whole lot earlier. And especially I've seen even with girls where they experience puberty way earlier than many of the girls that we grew up around with many years ago. And of course, our kids struggle with issues of race in America. Something we never had to think about because growing up in the village, pretty much everybody was black. And so the issue of race was never a thing. The kids we're raising today really struggle with that, especially when they live in communities where there are far fewer people that look like them. So as I mentioned earlier, this video is one of the few videos that I absolutely have no words of advice to share like I typically do. I'm just going to open it up and hear from folks who have learned that could share with us. But here are some of the things that personally I'm really struggling with that I've also seen my peers struggle with. The first is that, again, we are trying to parent in the same way we were parented growing up. And a lot of that is really not working. I may not share a lot of examples here because of privacy, but I've tried that and I've really failed on so many things, just trying to do that. So much of what we're doing is a lot of trial and error, basically building a plane while flying it. And that sometimes really does not work. And most of us, or some of us, are really not sure how to raise black kids in America, in a place where issues of race are really magnified. Because many of our kids are often seen as threats because of their race. Many of them will miss opportunities simply because of their race. And they're often less likely to receive appropriate support even in school because of their race. And unfortunately, some of them even get punished harsher than others. Especially when you have black and white kids in the same class. Your kid does the exact same thing their white friend does, and your kid will be punished much more harshly than the other white kids. So those of us who didn't grow up around issues of race as they are in America really don't know what to do with preparing kids to navigate this world of race in America. And unfortunately, of course, all of us who came from Africa as adults arrived as adults and, of course, never went through kindergarten through 12th grade in America. So there's so much we don't know about how this system works, to the point where kids come back with stuff or things happen in school that we don't even know how to respond. And in part, like I said, it's because we never went to school in America. So schooling in America is a very foreign concept for us as parents. And of course, we also have the daily pressures of work, where a lot of us spend many, many hours working to just keep things afloat. And as we commit more time to work, that often means we have less time to commit to our kids. And the one area that I'm also really struggling with is the idea of how to raise strong black women. My daughter is a very feisty young woman who is excited about life, and I'm wondering whether what I'm doing is right, or I'm just wondering, am I doing the right thing for her? At the end of the day, am I going to raise the proper, strong black woman that I desire to see in my child? And so those are some of the more complicated things. Some of the more mundane things like hair. I even go on YouTube to look at how to fix a girl's hair. I've been doing that for weeks now, and the results are disastrous. If there's any way somebody can teach me how to even fix my daughter's hair, I would love that. But in general, the bigger issue here is how do I raise a strong black woman in America with Kenyan roots? And so I know there are many, many folks who are out there who have successfully raised kids. There are people struggling with similar things. If you have suggestions that could help me or my colleagues who are really struggling, please share with us. There are fathers out there, mothers, aunties, and other skilled folks, other scholars who are doing this. Please help us with this. I hope this was helpful today. I didn't say much, but and before I forget, the meal I just prepared is called Kwon, Tong, and Sekoma. Thank you for joining us, and I will see you in the next. Bye.